Well, hello, my friends, and thank you for joining me today for Hope for Your Heart. This is Pastor Calvin Corbett joining you today for the Friday broadcast. And today I want to look at the faith of Joseph. Now, as we look at the life of Joseph, there's so much that could be said about him. I mean, there's a lot of chapters in the Bible, from Genesis 37 to the last chapter in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 50. We have the overview of the life of Joseph. So obviously, we can't cover it all, but I want to share with you some of the tests that Joseph went through and some of the things that he was victorious in as a result of living his life and how God blessed him in such a tremendous way. Now, the life of Joseph is an interesting story in that Joseph is one of the few characters in the Bible in which nothing negative is said about him. He's referred to in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, and I think the best way to look at his life today, since we just have a few minutes to examine his life, is to kind of look at the areas that he was tested in to see how he did. And then we can have a takeaway from how he went and encountered those tests to see how well we can do in the same or similar types of tests. Well, the first test that Joseph encountered is what I would call the favor test. In other words, God's favor was resting upon Joseph, and the father of Joseph, Israel or Jacob, showed favor upon Joseph. Now, this favor caused some problems, obviously, but how did Joseph respond to this favor? Now, a lot of people would say, well, he overreacted. Maybe he spoke too much about the favor that he had, and he had this coat of many colors. And as a result of talking too much about this favor that he had, even when he went to visit his brothers, right? And he's out there taunting, some would say, this coat of many colors. And when they see Joseph coming off in the distance, they're filled with jealousy. They're filled with rage toward him. And they grab him and they rip off that coat of many colors, and they were going to kill him. But thankfully, Reuben steps in, and Reuben says, well, let's not kill him. Let's make a little money off him. And they sell him after throwing him into a cistern, which is a pit where water was stored. It was dry. They throw him in there, but then decide to sell him to the Ishmaelites to make a little money on it. And so as we look at him, God's favor rested upon him, but not everybody was happy about that. And then we look at how God worked in his life, and how, as a result of this favor, that Joseph was still, in spite of that, a humble man. So I would say that he passed the favor test. Genesis chapter 37 says, Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other sons because he had been born of him in his old age, and he made him an ornate robe for him. Now when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So the favor test is, how do you respond when God's favor is upon you? How do you respond when somebody is jealous over the favor that God has placed upon you? So we fast forward the story of Joseph. We discover that he treated his brothers very well when they came back to him in needing food. The favor test is, I'm going to let this favor that God has given to me, and I'm going to pass that on to be a blessing to others. I'm not going to use this favor. I'm not going to use this authority. I'm not going to abuse it, but I'm going to use it to be a blessing to others. So that's the first test, the favor test. But then there's a second test that Joseph encounters, and it's called, I would call it the temptation test. And this is in Genesis chapter 29. Now, I'm leaving a lot of details out because of time, but we discover that Joseph is now in a very prominent position in Egypt. And as a result of this position, he has contact with his master's wife, with Potiphar's wife, and she notices him. And she notices that he is attractive, he is physically fit, and day after day, he is noticed by her. And then one day, she says to Joseph, come to bed with me. But he refuses. And this is what he says, with me in charge, he told her, my master doesn't concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns has been entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. Then she told him this story, that the Hebrew slave you brought us came to me and made sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and he ran out of the house. Now, when you look at this, there's a temptation that is put before Joseph. He's a young man, and obviously this was a real temptation, but look at how he responded. He recognized that this sin was going to be a sin not against Potiphar's wife only, not against Potiphar only, not even against himself, but this was a sin against God. When Potiphar's wife attempted to seduce Joseph, he refused by saying, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" You see, Joseph understood that yielding to her advances would be a betrayal of Potiphar's trust, but would be a grave sin against God's law. He did something else. He refused to be even with her. He set boundaries to protect himself. Joseph reminded her that Potiphar had entrusted him with everything in the household, except for her, because she was his wife. He emphasized that he could not compromise his master's trust, so he refused to be in her presence. He also was persistent in his refusal, refused to go to bed with her, even to be with her. He went out of his way to avoid being with her. And then he does something else. He actually flees from temptation. He doesn't sit around and say, well, let me figure out what I should do here in the middle of this situation. When she tries to force him, Joseph just flees. And he leaves his cloak behind. Now, Scripture teaches us that the wisest response to temptation, especially sexual temptation, is to avoid the entanglement, to flee from that temptation. He also faced the consequences with integrity. Potiphar's wife falsely accuses Joseph of attempting to rape her, to assault her, and has this cloak that he left behind as evidence. Now, Joseph was in prison because of this, but even in prison, the Lord was with him, granting him favor, giving him responsibility over the other prisoners. You see, wherever Joseph went, he was raised to a position of leadership. Now, Potiphar could have ordered Joseph killed for this alleged capital offense. Now, and as we look at this story, we discover that I think even Potiphar was not buying into this story completely of what his wife said, because he could have ordered Joseph immediately executed, but it doesn't. He puts him in prison. So here's my question on test number 2, the temptation test. How do you respond when your success creates false accusations? You know, we are given this overwhelming opportunity to walk by faith. There's a book written by David Haig. It's called The Obedience Option, and he illustrates what he calls overwhelming faith. Haig was talking to a young man who claimed that he couldn't stop his pattern of sleeping with different women. Now, the young man knew it was wrong, but he also claimed that his sexual drive and his lust was inevitable. Therefore, it wasn't his fault, especially since God created him with such strong desires and urges. Finally, Haig interrupted the young man and said, well, suppose that I came into your room and I caught you and your girlfriend as you were just starting this inevitable process. Suppose I took out 10 $100 bills and I told you that they were yours if you stopped doing what you were doing. What would you do? When the young man quickly said, well, I'd have to take the cash. I would stop and take the cash. So what happened to that irresistible force of lust? You see, Haig concluded, we both realize a very simple truth. One passion may seem irresistible until a greater passion comes along. If we take the principle into the area of righteous living, it comes out like this. The only way to overcome the passion for sin is to have an overwhelming passion for righteousness. This overwhelming passion for righteousness is actually a mindset the Bible calls faith. Here is a helpful definition of this kind of overwhelming faith. Faith is a life-dominating conviction that all God has for me through obedience is better by far than anything that Satan can offer through selfishness and sin. So that is the temptation test. How are you doing in that area of your life? Number 3 is what I would call the kindness test. We're going to fast forward the story to Genesis chapter 40. And in Genesis chapter 40, we discover that the cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot Joseph. This is an amazing test. Joseph is falsely accused. He's thrown into prison. And while he's in prison, he runs into some guys that have some dreams. One of the guys is the chief cupbearer. He interprets that a dream. And the only thing he asks of this guy is that this guy would remember Joseph when he goes to before Potiphar. Well, he totally forgot about him. Here's my question. How do I respond when my kindness is completely forgotten? I want to remind you that God remembers every act of kindness that you do. Everything that you do, God remembers. And God wants us to be in a position that we can bless others without having strings attached to it. I love the story of a neighbor, and there were 2 teenage girls, and they decided that they were going to bake some cookies for their neighbors instead of going to the school dance. They were going to spend their evening going around, taking these baked goods and just passing them out throughout the neighborhood. Well, the girls set out, and it was getting late in the evening, and so they left fresh baked goods at houses only with lights on. And it's getting late. It's 10 o'clock at night. And then they pounded on one particular home. The lights were on. They figured that somebody was awake. And a 49-year-old woman inside didn't answer the door, but she did experience anxiety over that late night visit. As a result, she went to the emergency room the next day, and the woman decided that she was going to sue the girls, and she actually won. The judge awarded the plaintiff $900 to cover the emergency room visit. The woman said that she wanted the girls to learn a lesson because they should not have been out late at night running from door to door. Something could have happened to them, she said. Well, after the story was published in the Denver Post, hundreds of readers were outraged that the girls were sued for dropping off a plate of cookies and a paper heart for their neighbors. Thousands of dollars poured in to help pay the girls' fine. Their story was reported on a national news program, and the girls appeared on the Saturday edition of Good Morning America. As a result of the publicity that they received, there was a fund that was set up for the girls, and enough money came in, and it was called the Never Forgotten Scholarship Fund for these high school students. You see, the girls were rewarded many times over for their act of kindness. Not everybody was happy about their act of kindness, but they were rewarded. So the saying, no good deed goes unpunished, is ultimately true. Even if our attempts to bless others are rejected and unrewarded in this life, God will one day bless us. And that's exactly what we see in the life of Joseph. He's given an opportunity to bless his brothers in the future. So that is what we would call the kindness test. Well, there's another test that you might face in your life, and I'm going to call this the prosperity test. This is found in Genesis chapter 41. And as we look at Genesis chapter 41, there are 7 years of abundance in Egypt, and it came to an end. And the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph has said. There was a famine in all of the land, but in the land of Egypt, there was food. Now, this is an amazing story. Remember, Joseph had that dream. There's going to be 7 years of famine, plenty rather, followed by 7 years of famine. Well, Joseph was wise enough to set aside food during those times of plenty. He had set it aside, and he was ready for the famine to come. Now, this is the prosperity test. How do you handle prosperity when it comes your way? Well, let's continue the story. We discover that Egypt began to feel the famine. The people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all of the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all of the storehouses and he sold the grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. Here we discover Joseph is given the prosperity test. How are you going to handle this blessing? A famine is coming. People are going to be losing their jobs. They're going to be losing their food. They're going to be starving to death. Will you be a blessing to them? Will you reach out to bless them as God has blessed you? How do you respond when my feast turns into a famine? You know, the Bible is very clear that we're to be generous and that we're to be a blessing to those who come to us in our time of need. And so will you be a blessing to others as a result of the prosperity that God has given you? Well, I've got to hustle on through because our time is quickly slipping away. There's another test that Joseph faced. Genesis chapter 42, and I'm going to call this the authority test. Joseph is now being reunited with his brothers. And as a result of this, the coming of the brothers, they're begging for food. There's no food, and they're needing to get food. And so they go up to Egypt. They confront Joseph. Joseph gave them orders to fill their bags with grain, to put the silver back into their sack, and he gave them provisions for their journey. When they get back home, they discovered that their silver had been returned, and it's there in their sack. And then their hearts begin to sink because they understood the authority that Joseph had to take their lives. Now, at this stage of the game, they don't know Joseph is Joseph. And so when you look at this, Joseph is in command. The brothers abused him when he was younger, but now the tables are turned. They're begging him for food. And when they figure this thing out, that he's given them not only their food, but the silver that they were going to use to pay for that food, we discover they are now begging for their lives. How does Joseph respond to this? Joseph does not use his authority to take vengeance upon his brothers. He could have. He could have said, hey, you know what? You guys have done me wrong all these years, and it's my turn to get you back. I'm going to take advantage of this situation. I'm going to flex the authority that I have. And when you look at the scriptures, we discover that Joseph had tremendous authority. He was called Lord. He was second in command. And here Pharaoh is giving him this opportunity to basically do anything that he wants. But Joseph keeps that authority in check. I think that Joseph understood ultimately that God is in control. And if God is in control, I submit to his authority and I treat others as God would treat me. Well, there's one final test that we're going to look at in the life of Joseph, and I'm calling this the forgiveness test. Genesis chapter 45, we discover the story is getting at the end, and Joseph has revealed himself to his brothers. He says, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Now, this is an amazing truth. Joseph here reveals his identity to his brothers. And he says, now, guys, don't be angry with yourselves. You've done something wrong. You meant it for evil, but God is going to turn this into good. The reason I'm in Egypt is so that I could be used by God to save lives. God sent me ahead of you. Now Joseph probably didn't appreciate the way it happened, but God had to get him from Canaan to Egypt. And God uses these brothers of his that hated him to carry about God's purpose. This reminds me of a wonderful verse in the Bible, Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good. Not all things are good, but God takes even the bad and he works it together for his purposes. All things work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purposes. Joseph is able to forgive his brothers of the terrible things they did to him because he understood the sovereignty of God. He understood that God was going to take the wrongness that was committed against Joseph and turn it into a blessing. That's how our God rolls. In Genesis chapter 50, we discover when Joseph's brother saw that the father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs that we did to him?" Now, we just jumped ahead 5 chapters from 45 to 50. We discover that in this time, Jacob comes back to visit Joseph with all the family, and they're going to settle in Egypt. But now Jacob has passed on. And now the brothers are very concerned. They're thinking, well, maybe now that the old man is gone, maybe as long as the old man was here, Joseph would be restrained and not take out vengeance against us. But now that the old man's gone, they feared that Joseph would take vengeance on them. But look at the response. The response is this. Verse number 16. So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins of the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." Now when the messenger came to him, Joseph wept. Now I find this pretty amazing. Joseph is weeping over the fact that the brothers still feel like he hasn't forgiven them. It breaks his heart because Joseph has forgiven, and there's a whole process of reconciliation that is taking place, but these brothers are still worried that Joseph is going to take out vengeance against him. So when I'm hurt, do I choose to forgive, or do I choose to take revenge? Forgiveness is an amazing truth. Many years ago, I was in a situation where I was driving a vehicle and I struck a person. And as a result of my negligence, I was 100% at fault. This person was injured fairly significantly. And I remember going through that whole ordeal where I had to go through, and I was charged with some things, and I had to go to court, and it took about a year to go through that process. And really, it was a year that I went through a time of depression. And I felt so badly about what I did to this individual, and I could not have under legal guidance. I couldn't have contact with this person until the legal matter was settled. And during this time, I really struggled, and I felt guilt. I felt remorse because I had done damage to somebody, and to no fault of their own. And so I'm going through this terrible time, and I'm feeling sorry for myself, and I can't break myself out of that whole situation. And so if you've ever gone through a bout of depression, that's kind of what I experienced. And I felt so guilty because I felt like I kept making it about me. And I at that time I was given a word to memorize, God's word to memorize, and that's where my life verse came in. There's no temptation taken us, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation also provide a way of escape so that you may be able to bear it. I felt this woe is me, that nobody understood what I was going through, and yet I had inflicted damage upon somebody else, and I didn't know how to really process that and deal with that whole thing. And so I'm working through this time, and I'm going through this difficult time, praying to God, getting counseling, and trying to get help to navigate through it. But I felt like I was stuck. I couldn't get beyond this point in my life, and I'm just praying and praying and praying, and finally the court issues are settled, and I'm able to have contact with this individual that I caused this great hurt and this great damage to. And you know what this person did? They graciously offered me forgiveness. They said, "I forgive you. I'm not going to hold anything against you. I'm not going to try to get vengeance against you. I realized it was an accident, and I completely forgive you." Two people were set free. I was set free, and that individual who forgave me was set free of bitterness and resentment. You see, that's how forgiveness works. So when you're hurt, do you choose to forgive, or do you choose to take vengeance? Well, thank you so much for listening to the broadcast today as we have studied the life of Joseph. This is the weekend Why don't you make plans to worship the Lord today or this weekend on Sunday? If you don't have a church home, why don't you come on down to Hickory Ridge Community Church, 3320 Battlefield Boulevard South in Chesapeake, Virginia. Love to see you at 9 o'clock or 10:45. If you're too far away to come in person, you can join us online. Thank you so much for this wonderful week of broadcasts. God bless you. I'm praying for you. If you'd like to hear this broadcast again, you can have a free download at buzzsprout.com, Hope for Your Heart with Pastor Calvin Corbett. Or you can listen on Amazon, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. You can also tune in to my YouTube channel, Hope for Your Heart with Pastor Calvin Corbett.
Hickory Ridge Community Church is located at 3320 Battlefield Boulevard South in Chesapeake, Virginia. Sunday service times are 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. We'd love for you to join us. For more information, go to hrcc7.org. And remember, no matter what you're going through, in Jesus Christ there is always hope for you.